Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
The afternoon sun began to cast long shadows, the orange hue of the sunset stretching across the cemetery fields. Helen, a woman in her 60s, stood silently by her son's grave, John. The wind gently blew through her white hair, carrying with it the faint sound of music from the violin in Helen's hand. She came here every Sunday, never missing a visit, whether rain or shine. "I'm here, John. I brought the violin you loved," Helen whispered, then began to draw the bow across the strings. The secret melody shared only by mother and son began to fill the silent air. It was a wordless tune, known only to the two of them, played many years ago. Every time she played it, Helen could feel John's presence beside her, as if he were still alive in every note. Memories of John came flooding back into her mind. He had been a passionate musician with a warm smile and bright eyes. More than just a devoted son, he was her best friend. The two of them had a special bond through music. They often spent afternoons together, crafting melodies meant only for them. Helen still vividly remembered the last time they played their secret song before John passed away. It was a brief moment of happiness she would never forget. Suddenly, light footsteps echoed from behind. Helen stopped playing and turned around. An elderly woman, Mrs. Alice, the caretaker of the cemetery, approached her. "Good evening, Mrs. Helen. It's Sunday again, isn't it?" Mrs. Alice asked gently, her voice familiar as a quiet companion. "Yes, Alice. I'm here to play for John again, though, perhaps, I'm just comforting myself," Helen replied, her gaze fixed on her son's grave. "Music has a way of healing wounds, doesn't it? I believe John hears you, wherever he may be." Mrs. Alice softly placed a hand on Helen's shoulder before quietly walking away, leaving Helen to her thoughts. Helen resumed playing, the melody becoming deeper, heavier with each note. Suddenly, from a distance, she heard a soft voice. "I know this song." Startled, Helen stopped playing and looked around. A small girl, about 5 years old, with blonde hair and blue eyes as bright as the sky, stood not far from her. The girl wore a white dress, her little shoes still dusty from the ground. "What did you say?" Helen asked, unable to hide her surprise. "I know this song. I've heard it before," the girl said confidently, her voice pure but filled with certainty. Helen stared at her. "That's impossible. Only my son and I know this song, only John and me." The girl simply smiled, saying nothing more. Helen felt something strange. How could this child know about a song she and John had composed and never played for anyone else? "Little one, what's your name? Why are you here?" Helen asked, a mixture of curiosity and unease in her voice. "My name is Emma. I come here with my mom. She told me not to go far, but I heard the music and came over," Emma replied, her eyes sparkling with an understanding that Helen couldn't grasp. Helen said nothing, just sat there staring at the girl. Part of her wanted to ask more, but another part felt confused and unsettled. The appearance of this child was too strange, as if a mystery was unfolding that Helen wasn't yet ready to face. "Maybe you're mistaken," Helen murmured. "You should go back to your mom, it's getting late." Emma looked at Helen for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but I'll be back." The little girl turned and ran off, leaving Helen sitting there, her mind full of unanswered questions. How did she know that song? And why did Helen feel such a strange connection to this small child? The sun had fully set, leaving only the last rays of light staining the sky red. Helen stood up, packed her violin, and quietly left the cemetery. On her way home, the image of Emma lingered in her thoughts. She couldn't explain the strange feeling the girl had left behind, but she knew that her life wouldn't be the same after meeting Emma. Who is that little girl? Helen wondered silently. And how did she know the song that only she and John knew? This question kept repeating in her mind, and she knew she would have to return to the cemetery to find the answer. Helen returned home after the strange afternoon at the cemetery, but her mind couldn't let go of the image of the girl named Emma. A feeling of discomfort, as if something was not right, followed her throughout the evening. Helen sat in her small house, holding a cup of hot tea, but her mind was busy with questions that had no answers. "It can't be," Helen whispered to herself. "How could that girl know the song I shared with John?" The doorbell rang, pulling Helen out of her thoughts. She set the tea down and went to the door. Standing there was her neighbor, Maria, an old friend who often dropped by in the evenings to chat. "Hello, Helen. I was passing by and saw your light still on, so I thought I'd stop by for a visit," Maria said with a warm smile, holding a basket of freshly baked bread. "Thank you, Maria. Please come in," Helen replied, trying to return the smile, but her mind was still heavy with the day's events. Maria entered, placed the basket on the table, and sat across from Helen. "You look worried, Helen. Did something happen?" she asked, her eyes studying Helen closely. Helen sighed and sat down beside her. "I met a strange little girl today, at the cemetery," she began. "A little girl? At the cemetery? Why would a child be there?" Maria asked, surprised. "That's what I'm trying to understand. Her name is Emma. She said she knew the song I was playing. A song that only I and John knew, no one else," Helen said, her voice filled with wonder. Maria frowned, skeptical. Maybe she heard it somewhere. Could John have played it for someone before? "No, that's impossible," Helen shook her head. "This song was a secret between me and John. We never played it for anyone else." Maria sat quietly for a moment before speaking. Maybe the girl overheard it somewhere. Sometimes children have ways of knowing things we don't expect. "But, she said she'd be back," Helen said, her voice tense. "I can't understand it. How could a 5-year-old child know all that?" Maria didn't reply, just looked at Helen with a sympathetic gaze. "Maybe you're overthinking it, Helen. Don't let it trouble you too much. It could just be a coincidence." Helen knew Maria was trying to comfort her, but the confusion in her heart hadn't eased. Their conversation continued for a few more minutes with talk of ordinary life, but Helen couldn't fully focus. Eventually, when Maria left, Helen sat back in her living room, enveloped in the silence of her empty home. The next day, Helen decided to return to the cemetery. Despite Maria's advice to forget the incident, something inside Helen urged her to find out more. She couldn't dismiss Emma's appearance so easily. As Helen stepped through the cemetery gates, the soft midday sun filtered through the trees, creating the familiar peaceful scene. She walked towards John's grave, feeling both anxious and filled with curiosity. As soon as she arrived, she saw a small figure standing beside her son's tombstone. "Emma?" Helen called softly. The little girl turned around, a light smile on her face. "I told you I'd be back." Helen walked closer, her heart filled with indescribable emotions. "How do you know the song that John and I used to play? Tell me the truth, did someone teach it to you?" Emma shook her head, her bright eyes glowing in the sunlight. "I don't know. I just know I've heard it before. I can't explain it." Helen looked deeply into the girl's eyes, searching for answers in the silence. But Emma said nothing more, simply standing there, thoughtful, as if waiting for something from Helen. "You're so young to be here by yourself. Where's your mother?" Helen asked, trying to change the subject, hoping it might give her a clue. "My mom is nearby. She always tells me not to wander too far, but I like walking around here. It's so peaceful," Emma replied, her gaze still fixed on John's grave. Helen felt a heaviness in her chest. This little girl was clearly very special, and that made it impossible for her to shake the feeling of unease. "Emma, next time you come back, could you tell me more about your mom? I just want to know." Emma nodded gently. "I'll come back. But I have to go now. The little girl turned and ran toward the cemetery gate, leaving Helen standing there, lost in her tangled thoughts. She knew something bigger was happening, but she couldn't quite grasp it. Helen took a deep breath and sat down by John's grave, feeling as though her son's presence was still nearby, right next to her, in every note of the music and in the strange things she was now experiencing. In the days that followed, Helen's mind couldn't stop thinking about the little girl, Emma. Each evening, she would sit in her quiet home, trying to sift through her memories to find anything that might explain the girl's appearance and the secret song. She wondered if she was dreaming. One morning, Helen decided to go out and visit the small cafe near her house. It was a place she and John used to sit and talk for hours every week when he was still alive. She needed somewhere to think, and perhaps a change of scenery would help clear her mind. As she walked into the cafe, she was greeted by the owner, Roberto, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a constant smile. He had grown accustomed to Helen's visits whenever she needed a moment of peace. "Hello, Mrs. Helen. It's been a while since I last saw you. Anything special bringing you here today?" Roberto asked, his voice warm. "No, I just wanted to get out for a bit," Helen smiled in return, though the fatigue on her face was hard to hide. Roberto signaled for one of his staff to bring Helen a cup of hot coffee, then sat down at the table with her, as he usually did. "You seem worried. Is something troubling you?" Helen hesitated for a moment before deciding to tell him about Emma. "I met a little girl at the cemetery. She's about 5 years old, and the strange thing is that she knew a song that John and I composed, only the two of us knew it." Roberto raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "A little girl knew your and John's song? That's strange. Did she say where she heard it?" "No," Helen shook her head. "She just said she had heard it before, but couldn't explain how. I don't know what to make of it anymore." Roberto sat in thought for a while before speaking. "Maybe it's just a coincidence, Helen. But if you're really worried, you could try to find out more about her. There has to be something we don't know yet." Helen nodded. "I've thought about that too. I'll go back to the cemetery and hope to see her again." Roberto smiled kindly. "We're always here if you need someone to talk to. Sometimes just talking things out can help ease the burden." Helen thanked Roberto and turned back to her cup of coffee. The brief conversation had lightened her mood a little. Her decision was clearer in her mind now. She would return to the cemetery and learn more about Emma. A few days later, Helen returned to the cemetery, the familiar scene of shaded trees and peaceful quiet greeting her. She sat down by John's grave, as usual, and began to play the song they had composed together. The sound of the violin echoed in the stillness, but this time, Helen wasn't entirely focused on the music. She kept glancing around, waiting for the little girl to appear. After a few minutes, as expected, a familiar, clear voice called out from behind. "I'm back." Helen stopped playing and turned to see Emma, smiling just as she had before. The little girl walked closer and sat beside her. "Did you hear that song?" Helen asked, her voice soft but filled with hope. "I did. It's very beautiful," Emma answered, her bright eyes looking up at Helen. "I like listening to it." Helen gazed at Emma, unable to contain her curiosity. "Emma, can you tell me more about your mother? I want to know who she is." Emma smiled. "My mom's name is Sarah. She's very busy, so she can't come here often. I usually walk around the cemetery by myself." Helen's heart skipped a beat when she heard the name, Sarah. She remembered that John had once mentioned a girl named Sarah, a special student he had taught music to. The name stirred up too many memories, and now it returned with a powerful intensity. She had never met Sarah, but the name was not unfamiliar. "Did you say, your mom's name is Sarah?" Helen asked again, her voice lower. "Yes," Emma answered simply, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Helen looked down at John's grave, the pieces of the puzzle in her mind slowly starting to fall into place. But she didn't want to jump to any conclusions too quickly. "Can you bring me to meet your mom?" she asked, her voice becoming more urgent. Emma smiled softly. "Maybe one day. But today, I can't. My mom is very busy." Helen sighed, but she knew she was getting closer to the truth. She had to be patient. "All right, Emma. But next time, I really want to meet your mom." "I promise," Emma said, then stood up. "I have to go now. See you later." The little girl turned and ran off once again, leaving Helen sitting there, her heart pounding in her chest. Helen returned home after her meeting with Emma, her mind full of thoughts about the name, Sarah. That name haunted her the entire evening. She remembered the times John had spoken about his special student, someone he seemed to care about more than just as a teacher. Sarah, could it really be her? Helen wondered, trying to connect the dots. Thank you for watching the video all the way through. You are our biggest motivation to keep creating. Let us know where you're watching from so we can see how far this video has reached around the world. Don't forget to hit like if you found it interesting, and share it with your friends too. She paced around her small living room, her mind a tangle of thoughts. Finally, unable to bear the curiosity any longer, Helen decided to find out more about Sarah. The next morning, she visited an old friend, Marta, who had known John when he was still teaching music. Marta lived in a small neighborhood near Helen's house and was always willing to listen to her friend's stories. "You came at just the right time. I just finished making tea. Come in and join me." Marta welcomed her as she opened the door. Helen smiled lightly and stepped inside, but the worry in her eyes didn't escape Marta's keen observation. "Are you worried about something? What's been going on?" Marta asked as soon as they sat down at the table. "I know you've been through a lot since John passed, but lately, you seem even more tense." Helen sighed, staring at the teacup in front of her. "I need to ask you about someone. Sarah. Do you remember that name?" Marta nodded, her eyes showing surprise. "Sarah? She was the girl John used to teach music to. She was very talented, and John always paid her special attention. I remember they seemed really close. Why do you ask about her?" Helen hesitated, then told Marta about the little girl, Emma, whom she had met at the cemetery. She explained how the girl knew the secret song she and John had shared, and that Emma's mother's name was Sarah. Hearing this, Marta fell silent, her eyes growing serious. "Do you think this girl could be connected to John somehow?" Marta asked after a moment of silence. "I'm not sure," Helen admitted. "But as time passes, I feel there is some sort of connection. I can't shake this feeling." Marta took a sip of her tea, then looked directly at Helen. "If you really want to know the truth, maybe you should meet Sarah in person. You can't live with this uncertainty forever." Helen sat quietly for a moment. Marta was right. She had to get to the bottom of this. If Emma was really connected to John, she couldn't just let it go. A few days later, Helen returned to the cemetery, hoping to see Emma again. Her heart beat faster at the thought of what she might learn about Sarah. Helen sat by John's grave, her violin in hand, but this time she didn't play. She waited, full of curiosity and anxiety. After a few minutes, light footsteps approached from behind. She turned around and saw Emma, wearing her white dress, her blue eyes shining. "You came back," the little girl said cheerfully. "Were you waiting for me?" Helen nodded, overwhelmed by a feeling she couldn't explain. "Yes, I have something I need to ask you." Emma sat down next to Helen, her innocent eyes gazing up at her attentively. "What is it?" Helen took a deep breath. "Can you tell me more about your mother? I want to know more about her." Emma tilted her head and smiled. "My mom is very kind. She loves music and always teaches me how to play. She also had a very good teacher. Helen felt her heart tighten. She asked carefully. Was that teacher John? Emma nodded, her smile unchanged. Yes, that was Mr. John. My mom says he was the most wonderful person she ever knew. Helen swallowed hard, her emotions swelling. Can you take me to meet your mother, Emma? I would really like to meet her. Emma thought for a moment, then replied. My mom is very busy right now. But I promise, I'll tell her that you want to meet her. She'll understand. Helen looked at the girl, her heart filled with both doubt and hope. She wanted to know the truth, but feared it might hurt her. One thing Helen knew for sure, she couldn't turn back now. Thank you, Helen said gently. I'll be waiting. Emma stood up, smiling and waving at Helen. See you next time, she said before running off, as she always did. Helen sat there alone, her heart full of mixed emotions. Her life was slowly changing, and it was no longer just her imagination. She knew that next time, there would be more revelations, and perhaps the answers she sought would soon come. She stood up, took one last look around the quiet cemetery, then slowly made her way home. Her mind swirled with thoughts of the next meeting with the mysterious little girl and her enigmatic mother. The days that followed were filled with anticipation. Helen found it hard to focus on anything other than her encounters with Emma. She constantly wondered what new answers the girl might bring next time, and whether she would finally meet the woman named Sarah. That name lingered in Helen's mind, stirring vague memories of John and stories left untold. She knew that the next encounter could be a turning point, but fear mixed with excitement. One Sunday afternoon, Helen decided to return to the cemetery, as she had done for many years. She brought her violin, but this time it wasn't just to play for John. She also hoped to see Emma. As she entered the cemetery, the air was unusually still, as if everything was waiting for something to happen. Helen sat down by John's grave, her fingers lightly gliding over the violin strings. The familiar melody that she and her son had composed echoed through the quiet air, but today it felt different, as if a new energy was flowing through each note. As she played, she kept glancing around, looking for the bright-eyed girl. Before long, the familiar sound of soft footsteps came from behind her. Helen stopped playing, turned, and saw Emma with her radiant smile. The girl walked over and sat down next to her, as if it had already become a habit for the two of them. You play that song so beautifully, Emma said, her eyes sparkling. I love listening to it. Helen smiled gently. Thank you, Emma. I always play this song for John, but I'm glad you like it too. They sat in silence for a moment. Helen felt a strong connection to the girl, but her mind was still filled with unanswered questions. She decided to break the silence. Emma, you told me you'd talk to your mother about me wanting to meet her. Did you? Emma nodded, her smile as bright as ever. I did. My mom said she'll meet you, but not just yet. She's really busy. Helen felt a twinge of disappointment but tried to stay calm. I understand. I just really want to meet your mom. I feel like there's something important we need to talk about. Emma looked at Helen for a moment, then said softly. My mom feels that way too. She said she'll meet you when everything is ready. Helen felt a small flicker of hope. She knew she needed to be patient, but the waiting wasn't easy. Thank you, Emma. I'll wait, Helen said, her voice filled with emotion. But, why is your mom so busy? Does she do something very important? Emma thought for a moment, then replied. My mom is a music teacher. She loves her work. She's always busy with her students and performances. Helen nodded, finding the explanation reasonable. She remembered that John had mentioned Sarah and her passion for music. However, that didn't explain why she was avoiding meeting her. Emma, have you ever told your mom about me? Helen asked, trying to uncover more clues. Emma smiled and nodded. Of course. My mom knows who you are. She says you're a very special person. Helen's heart trembled slightly. The girl's words held so much meaning, but she couldn't fully grasp it yet. She wanted to ask more, but felt she might be pushing too hard. Still, her curiosity kept her searching for answers. So, when will your mom have time to meet me? Helen asked, her voice tinged with urgency. Emma looked down at the ground, as if deep in thought. I'm not sure. But my mom said it would be soon. Please be patient for a little while longer. Helen sighed. She had been patient for so many years since John's passing, but this waiting felt more difficult than anything else. Yet, looking into Emma's bright eyes, she knew she had no choice but to trust the girl's promise. All right, I will wait, Helen said, trying to smile. You are very lucky to have such a mother. She must be a wonderful person. Emma smiled, her eyes shining with pride. Yes, my mom is the best. You'll see when you meet her. Helen sat there, feeling the peacefulness of the cemetery envelop her. The wind blew gently through the trees, carrying the scent of spring. They sat together in silence, but the bond between them grew stronger with each passing moment. The afternoon wore on, and the sun began to set behind the distant mountains. Emma stood up, as she always did, ready to leave. I have to go now, Mrs. Helen. My mom is waiting for me at home. Helen nodded, her heart full of emotions. Goodbye, Emma. I'll keep waiting. The little girl waved goodbye and walked away, her small feet gliding through the green grass. Helen watched her until she disappeared behind the rows of graves. She knew she wouldn't be able to stop thinking about the girl and her mysterious mother. On her way home, Helen told herself that the next meeting would be the deciding one. She would meet Sarah, and perhaps then, all the secrets would be revealed. The questions that had plagued her, about the music, the connection between them, would finally have answers. But until then, she would have to be patient and wait, just as she had done for so many years. Helen sat in her small kitchen, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. Every day, she felt closer to the truth, yet it was as though she was suspended in mid-air, waiting for something that had no clear arrival time. She had met Emma several times, and though the girl always promised her mother would soon meet her, the fulfillment of that promise still seemed distant. Today, Helen decided she had to be more proactive. She couldn't continue living in this uncertainty. She remembered John mentioning Sarah, a woman he seemed to care for deeply, but John had never shared more. Now, the name had reappeared, along with a strange little girl who knew the secret song they had composed. Helen stood up, ready to go out. She needed more information about Sarah, and the first person she thought of was Marta. Marta was the only one who knew much about John's past and the people around him. At Marta's house, Helen sat down on an old wooden chair and didn't wait long to get straight to the point. Marta, I really need your help. I have to find Sarah. Marta looked at Helen in surprise. Are you sure? I don't think that will be easy. Since John passed away, Sarah disappeared from everyone's sight. I haven't heard anything about her in years. Helen sighed, but the determination in her voice didn't waver. Emma, the little girl I met at the cemetery, is Sarah's daughter. I can't just sit back any longer. Maybe she can give me the answers about the connection between them and John. Marta was silent for a moment, her elderly eyes full of thought as she looked at Helen. I understand. But finding Sarah won't be simple. However, Marta hesitated, as if weighing her words. What is it? Helen asked, leaning forward. Do you remember Mrs. Alice, the cemetery caretaker? Marta sipped her tea before continuing. I once heard her mention that Sarah occasionally stops by the cemetery on other days, not Sundays. Maybe Mrs. Alice knows something. Helen nodded. I'll go see Mrs. Alice right away. When Helen arrived at the cemetery, she found Mrs. Alice trimming the rose bushes by the entrance. Mrs. Alice had been doing this job for many years, and her sharp eyes missed nothing. Helen approached her and greeted her. "Mrs. Alice, may I ask you something?" Helen began, her voice thoughtful. Mrs. Alice straightened up, smiling warmly at Helen. "Of course, Helen. What's on your mind?" Helen hesitated briefly before continuing. "I heard that you might know a woman named Sarah, someone who comes to the cemetery on days other than Sunday. Can you tell me anything about her?" Mrs. Alice frowned, then squinted as if trying to recall. "Sarah, yes, I remember. A young woman who often comes here in the quiet afternoons, bringing flowers and standing silently by John's grave." Helen felt her heart quicken. "Do you know why she comes?" Mrs. Alice shook her head. "I didn't ask, and she never said much. She just stood there quietly, placed the flowers, and then left. She always looked so sad." Helen tried to hide her disappointment at not learning more. "Do you know where she lives or what she does?" Mrs. Alice looked at Helen for a moment and then said, "I'm not entirely sure, but once she mentioned teaching music to children at a center near the old neighborhood. You could try looking there." Helen thanked Mrs. Alice and quickly left the cemetery. Mrs. Alice's suggestion might be the clue she had been waiting for all this time. Though she still didn't know exactly where Sarah was, knowing that she was teaching music gave Helen hope. Helen stood in front of the music center Mrs. Alice had mentioned, her heart filled with anxiety and anticipation. She walked inside, where the quiet space was filled only with the soft sound of music playing from one of the practice rooms. A young woman sat at the reception desk, greeting Helen with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" the young woman asked. Helen carefully chose her words. "I'm looking for someone named Sarah. Does she teach music here?" The young woman frowned, thinking for a moment before nodding. "Yes, we have a teacher named Sarah. But she's not scheduled to teach today. Would you like to leave a message for her?" Helen felt disappointed but tried to remain calm. "Thank you, but I need to meet her in person. Can you tell me when she usually works?" The receptionist checked the teaching schedule on her computer screen, then replied. "Ms. Sarah usually teaches in the afternoons on Mondays and Thursdays. You could try coming back on one of those days." Helen thanked the receptionist and left the center. She had made progress, but now she had to wait a few more days to meet Sarah. Her heart was filled with a mixture of anxiety and hope. She wondered if, when she finally met Sarah, all her questions would be answered and what might change in her life after that encounter. On her way home, Helen stopped at her favorite cafe. She decided to go inside and relax, to reflect on everything. As she sat down, the warmth of the hot coffee in her hands, Helen realized that meeting Sarah could be the key to unlocking the past she had been searching for all this time. And she would not give up until she found the answers. On Monday afternoon, Helen stood in front of the music center's gate, her heart filled with anxiety and anticipation. She had waited for this day with nearly depleted patience. This was her chance to meet Sarah and possibly understand the connection between Sarah, Emma, and John. She took a deep breath, stepped inside, and felt her heart beat faster with each step. Inside the center, the soft sound of piano music drifted from a distant classroom. At the reception desk, the young woman Helen had met before was reading a book. When she saw Helen, she smiled and waved. "I remember you. You're here to see Ms. Sarah today, right?" the receptionist asked with a friendly tone. Helen nodded, trying to return the smile. "Yes, is she here?" The receptionist checked the list on her computer screen and said, "Ms. Sarah is teaching in classroom number 3. You can wait outside, the lesson will be over in about 15 minutes. Helen thanked her and walked down the hallway where the classrooms lined up. The piano music still played steadily from classroom number 3, where Sarah was teaching. Helen stood there, quietly listening to the music. She couldn't help but feel something very familiar in the way it was played, in the way the gentle yet powerful notes resonated. She wondered if this was John's influence or merely a coincidence. When the music stopped, the door to the classroom opened, and a young girl stepped out, followed by a woman. Helen knew immediately that it was Sarah. She stood still, her eyes fixed on the young woman with long black hair and a slender figure. Sarah smiled as she said goodbye to the girl, then turned back to gather her belongings. Helen took a deep breath and approached. Sarah. Hearing her name, Sarah turned around, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw Helen. She said nothing for a moment, as if trying to recognize the woman standing before her. Sarah hesitated, her eyes filled with sudden shock. I'm Helen. John's mother, Helen said, her voice trembling with emotion. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes suddenly brimming with emotions. She took a step toward Helen, then stopped, unsure how to react. You came here because... I came here to learn about my son, Helen interrupted, her voice stronger now. And about my granddaughter. Emma. At the mention of her daughter's name, Sarah looked down, her shoulders trembling slightly. I knew this day would come, but I didn't know what to say. Helen felt her heart tighten, seeing Sarah like this. She hadn't come here to blame her but to seek answers. I'm not here to accuse or blame anyone. I just want to know the truth, about my son and my granddaughter. Sarah sat down on a nearby chair, her eyes still cast to the floor. John was the greatest love of my life. But when he passed, I didn't know how to face life anymore. I was scared, I was in pain, and I chose to hide the truth about Emma. Helen sat beside her, her heart swelling with emotion. So why does my granddaughter know the song that John and I composed? I don't understand. Sarah gave a soft laugh, her voice barely a whisper. Emma is a special child. Even when she was very young, she could play pieces of music I never taught her. I don't understand it either. But maybe it's John's way of staying connected with us. Helen sat silently, Sarah's words bringing back memories of her time with John. Perhaps John was still here, through the music, living on in his daughter. Why didn't you ever come to find me? Helen asked, unable to hide her sadness. Sarah sighed, her eyes glistening with tears. I was afraid. I was afraid you wouldn't accept me or Emma. I didn't want to bring more pain to you. I couldn't face you after John passed. Helen gently placed her hand on Sarah's, her eyes soft. Sarah, I don't blame you. I just want to know my granddaughter and to help you. I've already lost so much, and I don't want to lose anything more. Sarah looked up at Helen, her eyes losing some of their fear. Emma always asks about her grandparents. She wants to know about her family, about her roots. Helen smiled, her heart full of love. Then don't keep it a secret anymore. Let me and Emma get to know each other, and John too. I want to reconnect our family. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I want that too. I'm sorry for hiding all this time. Helen embraced Sarah gently. It's never too late. From now on, we'll rebuild the bond John left behind. Sarah nodded softly in Helen's arms, as though she had finally found comfort. Helen felt a sense of relief, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new journey. After saying goodbye to Sarah, Helen stepped out of the music center, her heart full of emotions. She had found the answers she had been searching for, but at the same time, a new door had opened before her. She would meet Emma again and tell her about her family and the father she had never known. Helen knew that this journey wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it all. For John, for Emma, and for herself. The next day, Helen sat by her window, with sunlight gently streaming into the room, creating a peaceful atmosphere. She had met Sarah and finally knew the truth about Emma. But now, she faced an even more difficult task, meeting Emma again and telling her the truth about her real family. Helen knew that Emma was a special child, sensitive and wiser beyond her years. The girl not only had a strange connection to music but also a unique understanding of the world around her. But still, Emma was just a child. Explaining John's story and their family connection wouldn't be easy. That afternoon, Helen decided to return to the cemetery. She wasn't sure she would meet Emma, but she knew that if she did, she would have to confront the truth she had been holding inside for so long. She wasn't afraid anymore, but her heart was full of mixed emotions, nervousness and hope. When Helen arrived at the cemetery, as usual, the quiet and peaceful surroundings welcomed her. She sat down by John's grave, placing her violin beside her, but this time she didn't play. She just sat there, looking at the trees and taking deep breaths, trying to prepare herself. Before long, Helen heard the familiar sound of soft footsteps. She turned and saw Emma, with her bright smile, walking toward her. "You're here again," Emma said softly. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come today." Helen smiled and motioned for the girl to sit beside her. "Yes, I came to see you. But today, I need to tell you something important." Emma sat down, her clear blue eyes gazing up at Helen, full of curiosity. "What is it? Is something wrong?" Helen took a deep breath, knowing it was time to reveal the truth. "Emma, do you know that you're part of my family? I'm not just someone who comes here to visit John. I'm your grandmother." The girl's eyes widened, but she didn't look scared or confused. Instead, Emma quietly looked at Helen, as if trying to absorb everything she had said. "My grandmother?" Emma asked, her voice full of surprise. "I didn't know, my mom never told me." Helen nodded, gently placing her hand on the girl's shoulder. "I know. Your mom kept it a secret because she was afraid. She didn't know what to do after your father, John, passed away. But now, she and I have talked, and she has told me everything. I am your grandmother, and John, your father, was my son." Emma sat still for a moment, her eyes seeming to grow deeper as she processed the information. Finally, she let out a long breath, as if she had begun to understand. "So, that means I have a father, and he was John?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Helen nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Yes, my dear. John was your father. He loved music, just like you. And I believe that, even though he's no longer here, he still lives on through you in every note you play." Emma said nothing, only sat there quietly, looking at the ground. After a moment, she turned to Helen, her eyes filled with tears. "I never knew about him, but I've always felt like there was something special when I play music. Like I'm talking to someone." Helen's heart swelled with emotion, and she gently wrapped her arms around the girl, holding her close. "You're never alone, Emma. Your father is always with you, even if he can't be here physically." They sat there in that moment of emotional silence, the wind gently blowing, carrying the scent of green grass and wildflowers. Helen felt as though a burden had been lifted from her shoulders, and now, she could start rebuilding the family bond John had left behind. After a while, Emma looked up at Helen, her bright eyes shining. "So, can I visit you more often? I'd love to hear more stories about my dad." Helen smiled and nodded. "Of course, dear. I'll tell you everything about your father, what he loved, and all the memories we shared together." Emma smiled softly, nodding in return. "I'm really happy you're my grandmother. I think I'll like learning more about my family." Helen's heart filled with happiness, knowing that from now on, she would no longer be alone. Her family, despite all the loss and pain they had endured, was finally reconnecting through music and love. She had found peace, and now she could share it with her granddaughter. As time went on, Helen's life became fuller with the regular presence of Emma and Sarah. The two of them were like a new light, dispelling the emptiness that John had left behind. Life for Helen, Sarah, and Emma had changed completely. No more distance, no more secrets. The three of them decided to live together in Helen's cozy little home. The house, once quiet and empty, was now filled with laughter, conversation, and most of all, music. Each morning, Helen was the first to wake up, preparing breakfast for the family. She loved the busy feeling in her little kitchen, the scent of freshly baked bread and hot tea filling the room. On a spring morning, while Helen was baking bread, Sarah walked into the kitchen with a bright smile, looking happier than ever. "You wake up so early. Let me help you today," Sarah said, pulling a chair closer to the table. Helen smiled, her hands still busy with the dough. "Let me take care of it. You were teaching all afternoon yesterday, you must be tired." Sarah shook her head, her eyes glowing in the sunlight streaming through the window. "Not at all. Teaching the kids makes me feel more alive. Every time I see them excited about music, it reminds me of John. He would be so proud of us." Helen nodded, her heart filled with pride. "John always wanted us to be happy. And now, I feel like our family is truly whole again." At that moment, Emma burst into the kitchen, her cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkling. She had just finished learning a new piece of music and couldn't wait to show her mother and grandmother. "Grandma, Mom. Today I learned a new song, and I'm going to play it for you after breakfast," Emma said, her voice filled with excitement. Helen looked at her granddaughter, her heart brimming with joy. "Wonderful, Emma. We can't wait for your performance." Breakfast was warm and peaceful. After they finished eating, the three of them sat in the garden to relax. In the garden, the roses that John had once loved were blooming, creating a serene setting. Emma took out her small violin and began playing the new song she had just learned. The clear notes filled the quiet air, moving both Sarah and Helen deeply. As the music ended, an old neighbor of Helen's, Mr. Roberto, the cafe owner, happened to walk by. With his kind smile and friendly demeanor, he couldn't help but stop when he heard the music. "Wow, that was beautiful. This little one is certainly a future artist," Roberto complimented as he stepped into the garden. Emma blushed, bowing her head in thanks. "Thank you, Mr. Roberto. I still have a lot to learn." Helen laughed, inviting Roberto to sit down. "Roberto, it's been a while since you dropped by. How have you been?" Roberto nodded, his eyes resting on Emma. "I've been well. But you seem much happier than before. It's wonderful to see your family together like this." Sarah smiled and sat next to Helen. "We've been through a lot, but now we've found each other again. Nothing is more precious than family." Roberto looked at them, his eyes full of empathy. "I'm so happy for you. John would surely be proud of the three of you." They sat and talked under the gentle sunlight, the sound of birds singing from the tall trees above. After playing her music, Emma ran around the garden, picking fresh roses to place on the table. "I think Dad would love these flowers," Emma said as she set the bouquet of roses on the table. "I always feel like he's here with us." Helen took her granddaughter's hand, her eyes gentle but full of emotion. "You're right, Emma. Your dad is always here, in the music, in every moment we share." Sarah sat quietly, her eyes glistening as she listened to her daughter and mother-in-law. She knew that even though John was gone, his love and presence lived on within this family. "It's taken us a long time to get here, but now everything feels complete," Sarah said softly, looking at Helen and Emma with deep gratitude. "We'll always be together, no matter what." Helen smiled, her heart filled with contentment. "Yes, we'll always be a family." The days passed in peace and happiness. The lives of the three generations living under one roof were not only filled with joy but also brought healing to all of them. Every day, Helen taught Emma life skills and how to care for the garden. Sarah continued her work teaching music, but now, she valued the balance between work and family more than ever. One afternoon, the three of them sat together in the living room, and Helen brought out an old wooden box she had kept for many years. Inside were letters, photos of John, and keepsakes from his childhood. "I want you to know more about your father," Helen said as she opened the box. "These are the things your dad cherished. You'll learn more about him through these mementos." Emma curiously opened each letter and picture. She smiled as she looked at pictures of John in his youth, his bright smile and passionate eyes showing his love for music. "I wish I could have met him," Emma said, her voice sad but full of hope. Sarah gently embraced her daughter. "You didn't get to meet your dad, but he's always here, in all of our hearts." Helen sat beside them, holding both mother and daughter's hands. "We'll live together, love each other, and cherish these moments." That's what John would have wanted most. And so, under that little roof, the family of Helen, Sarah, and Emma found happiness, in every note of music, in every smile, and in every moment they shared together.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.